You know you've made it in life when your car is used as an expression for excellent quality. Duesenberg, the illustrious car company that was the poster car for much of the 1920s and 1930s. A legendary car company renowned for its superb build quality, ultra luxury and extreme performance. The true American company that competed to the likes of the Continental Rolls-Royces and Bugattis. But due to a Great Depression in the 1930s, the parent company that owned Duesenberg went bust, and with that, the once legendary brand also disappeared. Welcome everyone to a doozy 59th episode of the Automotive History series, where we're going to take a look at some of the attempts that were made to revive this once legendary brand. As it turns out, it's a lot tougher than it seems. The Duesenberg Motors Company was established in 1913 by the Duesenberg brothers, originally from Germany. The brothers already had a long history in racing, whether it were bicycles or cars, and decided to take on the "what wins on Sunday sells on Monday" approach. In order to finance their racing shenanigans, they sold some race cars converted for personal use on the side. They gained quite a recognition with the craftsmanship and winning quite a few important races all over the world. This went fairly well until the mid-1920s, when they could no longer afford to keep doing this, and they were bought out by the Cord Automobile Company. The management of Cord decided that they wanted to turn Duesenberg into an ultra-luxurious car brand, one that would rival the other great luxury brands out there at the time. And so by the late 1920s, just before the crash of '29, Duesenberg released the last of the great cars, the Model J, an absolute pinnacle of craftsmanship and engineering. Everything about these cars was expensive and impressive. These cars were favored by the jet set, royalty and important people of that time, which further launched the name into the stratosphere. The cream of the crop lies under the hood. An inline 8-cylinder or straight 8, 420 cubic inch or 6.9 liters was capable of making an amount of power not seen before. In its final iterations and supercharged, it could make as much as 400 horsepower, a record that wouldn't be beat in the next 20 years. Duesenberg offered the bare chassis and drivetrain so that customers could then send it to a coach builder for a custom body. A great example is the 1933 Ralston Arlington torpedo-bodied Duesenberg SJ with a retail price of 20 grand. This seems like a reasonable price for a new car as of today, but this was 1930s money. The famous story goes that the average annual salary of, let's say, a policeman was about $1,500. That means that one would have to save up all his money, not buy a single thing, pay no rent, eat nothing, and he could afford a Duesenberg after working over 13 years. But hey, you know what they say, you can live in a car but not race a house. Alas, by 1937 the depression had caught up with the Duesenberg's parent company, Auburn Cord Automobiles, and the company went bust. The once legendary Duesenbergs were no longer, and the rides and the names were sold. But that didn't stop certain individuals in trying to revive the company again. The first attempt to revive the legendary Duesenberg name can't even be seen as a full-blown revival, but more like a reboot or continuation of the then recently discontinued brand. Some source mentions that August himself, one of the two Duesenberg brothers, had ideas to revive the brand and bring it back into the public picture. Around the mid-30s, he envisioned a refresh of the current models. But shortly thereafter, in 1937, the parent company went bust and all assets, including Duesenberg, were sold. So the first attempt to continue the brand was going nowhere, and the name, rights and whatever that was left was bought by an American businessman who used it to keep producing replacement parts and take care of the aftermarket and customer side of things. And all was quiet until the Second World War broke out a few years later, and then things got even more quiet, as the whole American car industry came to a complete stop and had to switch making war material. In the meantime, the American businessman that bought Duesenberg then sold it again to another businessman that was savvy enough to once again persuade August in trying to give it another go as soon as the war was over. Demand for new cars was huge, so this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, where the cars would practically sell themselves. His idea? First, start updating those marvelous engines with the latest and greatest in engine technology. Think of fuel injection and new high-strength alloys. You gotta pump up those numbers. Next, what about an entirely new business model? Instead of selling cars, potential customers would lease them, but the cars would remain a company asset. According to the businessman, if you'd had one, you'd be a member of an exclusive society. That's the same marketing bullshit I hear today with various car brands. You are a member of a mobility society. Imagine being so rich that you can even afford not to own it. Around the same time when these wonderful ideas started to pop up, another newcomer and radical car company had roughly the same approach. Tucker. You know, the three-eyed car, and if you don't know, well, here you go. Go watch it. In an effort to acquire startup money, the Tucker Corporation sold, ahead of actual car production, various souvenirs and gear to future customers that already signed up for the car and paid a deposit. Considering the aftermath of the whole Tucker story and reading it in the newspapers, the gentleman behind the attempt to revive Duesenberg in a similar way decided to drop it. The second attempt to create a worthy successor of the 1930s Duesenbergs wasn't even a serious attempt, but more like a hobbyist's approach, and therefore a bit of a false start. By the early 50s, there was a man by the name of Mike Kollins who was particularly fond of the Duesenbergs, especially of what was under the hood. In fact, in 1950, he bought an old Model J, right around the time Duesenbergs were at their lowest value. They were 20-year-old cars after all. He envisioned what an updated Duesenberg ready for the 1950s would look like. So, he threw everything away, except the engine, transmission and some other parts. And he then took a brand new 1950 Packard super convertible and tried to shove the Duesenberg engine in that car. This was quite a challenge, however. The engine is a straight 8 cylinders in an upright position and in a row, leading to an unusually tall engine block which didn't fit under the fairly flat hood of the Packard. So, Kollins decided to make a hood bulge that neatly folded over the engine, and in the meantime gave the car an impressive and powerful look, just like the original. He also tinkered around with the engine, improving it in various ways, eventually making the claim that the engine made 400 horsepower, which would be a very impressive number. Think of it like 1,000 horsepower by today's standards, and I like to think that the number wouldn't be too far off, considering that the original engine already made power in the high 200s. To top it all off, he replaced the car's grille with a genuine Duesenberg grille, and did some other modifications. After quite a few years, in 1958, the car was finished. And so this car is officially referred to as a 1958 Kollins LeGrande, completely with its own personal badge, but unofficially this could have been seen as a what-if experiment. An experiment, an attempt at showcasing what Duesenberg would have looked like in the 1950s as a two-seat roadster with extremely powerful engine. After the one-off custom-built home garage hobbyist Kollins LeGrande Duesenberg, once again all was quiet. Until the 1960s. Around this time, some cars from the 1920s and 30s were old enough to be considered classic cars and had gone up in value. Classic car collecting started to emerge. Yet there were some people that wanted the looks of these cars, but not the hassle of driving and maintaining them, and so a parallel industry of so-called neoclassic cars started to emerge as well. Old looks combined with new tech, with a touch of retro or kitsch if you will. And if you want to know more, you get it. And in this automotive environment, a reintroduction of what is arguably the most legendary of 1930s cars would be the right choice, right? And it was, according to Fritz Duesenberg, the son of August Duesenberg. This time no hobbyist hocus pocus, but the real deal. A full-blown company, dealer network, and above all, a car, built by a custom coach builder and designed by an actual designer. The ambitions were certainly ambitious. It just had to be a modern-day Duesenberg, a car that knew no limits and was built to the highest standards or even beyond that. This was expressed through things like an overall size bigger than anything on the road at the time and an engine that was bigger than any engine at the time. Some say 500 cubic inch or 8.2 liters, and made more power than any other engine at the time, breaking the previous record that was held by, guess what, Duesenberg. 500 horsepower would be, suffice. And all this would be sold to the most affluent of buyers for the modest sum, and there he is again, 20 grand. When it comes to American luxury, you have your Cadillacs, you have your Lincolns, but the Duesenberg would stand far above it. A true American Rolls-Royce with a price tag that would otherwise allow you to buy 2 top-of-the-line Cadillacs. In the meantime, father and son had found a designer willing to work on the honorable task of designing a modern interpretation of an old legend. And there he is again, Virgil Exner. I have to come clean here. The sole reason I made this video is to talk about this man again. I just love him and his work. So far I made about 2 or 3 videos already where I talk about him, including a recent car review. And yes, you can also check that one out. Anyway, Virgil Exner was a visionary designer, always a step ahead of the competition. Well, most of the time. In the second half of the 50s, he worked for the Chrysler Corporation, designing the so-called forward-look cars. These cars were his rise and fall. By the early 60s, he designed rather quirky cars which weren't well received. He was fired after that, but decided to start up his own design consultancy firm with his son. Because the man had such an interest in introducing vintage styling elements on modern-day cars, call it retro styling, like freestanding headlights on the Imperials, he was eventually asked by a magazine to make some sketches for a few dead brands from the good old days, like Bugatti, Packard, and also Duesenberg. These sketches became known as the revival cars, and show some bizarre vehicles that are obviously a 60s interpretation of the 1930s. The Duesenbergs caught wind of these sketches and contacted Exner, asking if they would help them to design and shape the new car they had planned, because, well, he already made a sketch specifically for the brand without ever asking them. Exner could not only shape their ambitions, but also give advice on clever ways to build the car, to keep down cost and production complexity. In addition, Exner still had some close contacts over at Chrysler and the Italian coach builder Ghia. So when it comes to designing and producing their very first prototypes, everything was set. And so, in 1966, Duesenberg released with much fanfare the prototype, what was going to be an actual production model, the Duesenberg Model D. Most of the previous ambitions were realized, but some aspects were, of course, toned down a bit. You are looking at what is arguably the largest passenger car at the time ever. Even wider, longer, and heavier than many other American luxury land yachts, weighing close to 6,000 pounds or 3 metric tons, measuring over 20 feet or far over 6 meters in length, and just over 80 inches or 2 meters in width. Absolutely gargantuan. The car rode on an Imperial platform from Chrysler and also had a Chrysler drivetrain. The big 440 cubic inch V8 would do the job. This is a slightly smaller engine than the proposed 500 cubic inch engine, but close enough. Duesenberg would put a different carburetor on it and bump up the power just a bit more. The bodies would be hand-built in Italy and then flown into the USA, where they would be made into the Chrysler chassis and further completed. Naturally, every possible option, luxury item, or gimmick from the 1960s was part of this car. Everything was power assisted, and on top of that you get air conditioning, extra gauges providing information you wouldn't normally get on luxury cars, cruise control, and then some. Leather in the interior was the finest leather money could buy. The wood was the nicest of mahogany. Interesting details is the use of 2 fuel tanks, adding up to a total of 36 gallons or 136 liters. But considering the total package, you'd probably already burn through 1 or 2 tanks after reaching the end of your driveway. But can we talk about its design, please? In an effort to design a car that looked at the past, Exner accidentally designed a car that proved to be ahead of its time. The Model D features plenty of design elements that would be later adopted by practically the entire American car industry. Let's deconstruct it. The car features hidden headlights. This has been done before, but this setup was unusual for the mid-60s. By the 1970s, however, many cars featured hidden headlights. The car features a dominant central vertical grille that is a throwback to 1930s grilles. Many grilles during the mid-60s were very much horizontal, until the 1970s, when vertical waterfall grilles were all the rage. The car has a black vinyl top. These were just starting to gain traction in the automotive market. The car features flat wheel arches that are once again a reference to the separate fenders on 1930s cars. But these flat fenders were later adopted by some cars in the 1970s. All in all, the design influenced two cars in particular. The 1969 Lincoln Continental Mark III, which looks awfully similar like the Model D and was pretty much the first regular passenger car to go full chrome, and the Stud's Black Hawk, a limited production ultra-luxury 70s kitschmobile that also rode on the retro wave of the 1970s and was a similar attempt to revive a once legendary brand. The rumored cost of building one Duesenberg was around $60,000, so in that regard the ambition to sell them for $20,000 wasn't a dream but a necessity. And the price was of course no object for the target demographic. Those interested could send a deposit of $5,000 or really a brand spanking new Cadillac Eldorado convertible worth of it, and as many as 25 people were already interested in the car, and it was rumored that these were the people like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lewis. So everything was set. A famous designer designed the car that was built on regular production underpinnings by Italian craftsmen, and the American jet set lined up for the car. The whole deal was well underway until one of the biggest investors decided to back out of it, and everything collapsed after that. In 1.5 years, the story of attempt number 3 was over. Only one prototype was built and sold off to get some of that money back to pay off early investors. The car was then sent to a museum and not much was heard of Duesenberg again. Until the 1970s, another decade, another time to say, hey, the Duesenberg, huh? We should do something about it. This time it were the grandnephews of the original Duesenberg brothers, Harlan and Kenneth, that saw an opportunity in reviving the legendary brand once again and hopefully make some money off of it. The late 70s was a time when neoclassic or replica cars were at the most popular, not to mention the so-called Brougham era that was in full swing. Virtually every regular American car looked like it came from the 1930s with vinyl tops, waterfall grills and opera windows. They couldn't have chosen a better time, as the late 70s was also plagued by ever stricter safety and emission standards, along with a few oil and energy crises every now and then. This time, before getting started, the nephews already figured out that it would be near impossible to build their own car from the ground up. The car building game is complex, and you can sink a lot of money in developing an entirely new car. So this was not an option. Instead they figured, what if we built a customized version based on one of the finest cars money can buy at the moment? And they found out that the finest car was none other than the Cadillac Fleetwood Brougham. The nephews contacted General Motors and asked it if they could buy a bunch of Cadillacs, strip them, and build a customized body on top of them with an even more luxurious interior. After 3.5 years, the first prototype was ready. You are looking at a 1980s interpretation of the classic Duesenberg concept. I nicknamed it the Doozy Discoberg because what it essentially is a heavily rebuilt Cadillac, and not a good one at that. Once again, take a look at the Model D. You can see a designer worked on it. It's sculpted, unique, hides its basic underpinnings very well, and there is no car quite like it on the road. But this thing? After 3.5 years, you come up with this? It just looks like it left the home garage where father and son worked on it. There is no body sculpting but a square box, stacked headlights borrowed from a Chevrolet, and a waterfall grille from a Lincoln. Only unique element was the bumper, a direct reference to 1930s Duesenbergs, and pretty much the only reference. Sure enough, the interior was an upgrade over the original, but it was a poor attempt to hide the fact that it was essentially a heavily customized Cadillac, with late 70s emission-choke Cadillac power, and not the supreme performance numbers Duesenbergs were renowned for. Not to mention that nothing else was updated, not the brakes, not the suspension, or the underpinnings. The nephews suggested a similar setup as the previous attempts. The cars would be sold for the modest sum of $100,000. From today's perspective and adjusted to inflation, that's like buying a Bentley Continental GT. And as always, potential buyers had to pay a deposit, this time a modest sum of $25,000. And did I mention that you pay a mortgage worth of money for a heavily customized Cadillac? Somehow, the nephews found the customizations enough to justify the retail price, which was 6 times more than what the car it was based on. The deposit was even more than the retail price of the Caddy. You can probably see where this story is going to, but don't worry, there were once again buyers that were interested. But wouldn't you know it, the nephews couldn't get their financing right, and along that there was some troubles in the business organization that led to the collapse of another dream to revive the brand. In a couple years, this retro dream was also over. From here on out, it's pretty quiet when it comes to reviving Duesenbergs. After the latest revival attempt, the Duesenberg name still lived on in the shape and form of replicars. So for instance, a 101 copy of the original from the 1930s, but slightly upgraded equipment like brakes and transmission, and no original engine. These cars are almost identical to the original, but their correct model years are like from 1988. You have to appreciate the work that went into these cars. And that's pretty much it. In the 2000s, there were some rumors someone was trying once again to do another attempt at reviving the brand, so far even that it came to a design sketch. But other than that, it really is just the same cycle over and over again. Every so often, a new company claims, oh, they're gonna do it, and for real this time, and then it gets quiet again. What also doesn't help that it has been so long since the Duesenberg name was alive, so most people have forgotten about it. There is no 1930s retro nostalgia wave to ride on, and almost no people that actively remember what a Duesenberg is. But that doesn't mean that the original cars have also been forgotten. Quite the opposite, in fact. Classic Duesenbergs are the cornerstone of expensive car collecting. Many are still around in excellent condition, often found in car museums, prestige car shows, and private collections. Every once in a while, one gets sold through auctions, still going for very heavy prices that rival the original retail price, adjusted to inflation, of course. The many attempts could never replace the original as worthy successors. But trust me, Duesenberg is gone, but not forgotten.